this session, we're going to take a look at the process feature under security and compliance. Now, EventSentry actually ships with the complete tracking package that includes the process feature by default. So every host is going to get process tracking enabled. Now let's take a look at that feature and what it does. Now, by default, what process tracking does is it monitors every process that's being launched on any of the monitored hosts, provided that auditing is actually enabled. Just like many of the other compliance tracking features work, process tracking actually intercepts 4688 and 4689 events that Windows logs whenever a process starts and stops, and then parses and normalizes these events and stores only the relevant data in the EventSentry database. By default, every process is tracked. And if you go right here into the EventSentry web reports under features, processes, and activity, we can see that 25 hosts are currently recording process activity. We have a number of hosts here who are recording this. And we can skip over to the detailed tab to see what type of information EventSentry is recording. So taking a look here, we can see that we have a start and an end date. We have the duration of a process. We know which computer it was executed on, what type of computer that was, the actual executable that was launched, of course, who launched that executable. I'm going to expand that here a little bit. The login ID of that user, process ID and parent process ID. Whether it was an anomaly or not, that depends on the anomaly feature, of course. The token elevation, for example, was this an elevator process? And then we also have fields for command line and checksum that are currently empty because those are off by default. If you go back to the summary page, we see one of the nice features of any feature in EventSentry, of course, is that we can see a grouped list of all the processes that we're running. So we can see here that the AD monitor collector process is very active, that there is a command line host active, and we can also see the most active usernames here, along with the server types, host types, and so forth. So going back to EventSentry to the management console, first option we see here is track all processes except those listed below, and the second option, only track processes listed below. So this is similar to what we've seen throughout EventSentry, some of the other features. You usually take the approach of let's monitor everything with some exceptions, or we say we only want to monitor a select number of things. So here by default, we're monitoring everything. But what we're going to do now is we're going to say, you know what, we don't really need to fill a database with this AD monitor collector process. We know it runs all the time. We're going to exclude that. So that'll be our first exercise here. So if we hit the plus icon here, we can specify the process name, and we can take that right from here. So if we click on the detail tab, we can actually copy that. And note how it says either specify the full path to the executable or use wildcards with a partial match. So I would need to say, for example, asterisk like this, or if you want to be more secure and say we only want to exclude the one that's running from the EventSentry directory, then we'll include the path here. And now we have this fully covered. And we can also exclude the conhost process, for example, if you want to. That seems to be executed if we look here alongside the OM report.exe. So we could exclude those as well. Let's go here, copy that, and it's called OM report.exe. And then we have the system32 conhost.exe. So now those processes won't be monitored anymore. So before we do anything else, I'm going to go right here and deploy that just to activate that. But let's go back here. Another option we have is checksum. So if you enable this, and there's 3 different SHA options available, it will generate a checksum for every executable that's being launched. That checksum will be displayed along with a link to VirusTotal. So that allows you to basically verify that this executable is not malicious. And since generating a checksum does take some CPU time, you can select from a couple of different optimizations that will basically not regenerate the checksum if the last write time of the executable hasn't changed within a certain amount of time. Include command line. So this can be very useful, especially for troubleshooting, but also for security reasons. Of course, you can actually see the command line of each process that was launched. That does generally, it's recommended that you enable this in group policy, because this is actually an auditing option in Windows. If you don't do that in EventSentry, you can still try to obtain that command line through a couple of different means, but it's generally easier and faster and more efficient if this is enabled in Windows already. If we go back here and we go to our System32 site here and search for the 4688 event, that's actually the event that's being logged by Windows when a process starts. Then we can see the process command line here, and here it is explained how and where you enable this feature. So it's actually enabled in the registry, but can also be enabled with group policy. Sysmon network events. So if you have the Sysmon, which is free from sysinternals, installed on a system and configured to generate network events, that's event ID 3, then EventSentry can actually parse these events. That will show every time a process initiates a network connection. So this again can be very useful for forensics, and it can also integrate with NetFlow. So if you have NetFlow running on your network as well with EventSentry, then you can actually connect dots and see, okay, this process connected to this IP address, this host name by a port 443, 5000, whatever. And then you can actually jump over to the NetFlow reporting and see, okay, how much data was actually transferred, for example. Down here in the tracking details, as explained earlier, of course, auditing, the correct auditing has to be enabled for EventSentry to intercept all those 4688 and 4689 events. If auditing is not on, then you can enable it with EventSentry. That means the agent will, upon startup, verify the settings, and if it's not enabled, enable it. Or you can set it to leave audit settings alone. So if you're already managing your audit settings in your domain via group policy, which we highly recommend, then you don't have to do anything here. You can just say leave audit settings alone, and EventSentry won't do anything. But of course, if those 4688 events are not being logged, if process auditing is not enabled under detailed tracking, then you won't see any data there. And on the bottom, of course, you'll select one or more databases where the data is actually being written to. And if we go back now to process tracking and we go to the summary here, we'll see now that those processes that we excluded, so the OM report, collector and so forth, are gone. But we can see that there's still one process that we probably want to exclude, and that's the Postgres executable. So if we go back to the details here, we can take this path here, finally add this here as well. And the name of the process is postgres.exe. I'm just going to copy and paste to avoid typos, because I'm very good at typos. And yeah, so now this is excluded as well. So once this is deployed, that process is going to disappear as well. And then it's going to look pretty clean. We're just going to see relevant processes on that list. But that's pretty much it in terms of process tracking. Again, useful for troubleshooting, useful for forensics, and all sorts of other purposes. And especially useful with the Sysmon network events when that is turned on.